now consuming the Earth's resources faster than ever before. In fact, if everyone lived like an average European, the Earth could only support 2 billion in the long term.
We now realize that the disasters that continue increasingly to afflict the natural world have one element that connects them all: the unprecedented increase in the number of human beings on the planet. There have been prophets who've warned us of this impending disaster, of course. One of the first was Thomas Malthus. His most important book, an essay of the principle of population, was published over 200 years ago in 1798. In it, he argued that the human population would increase inexorably until it was halted by what he called misery and vice. Today, for some reason, that prophecy seems to be largely ignored, or at any rate disregarded.
Thomas Malthus was a political economist and Enlightenment thinker who observed a growing population with increasing concern. Malthus' theory contradicted the optimistic belief prevailing in the early 19th century that a society's fertility would lead to economic progress. Malthus' theory won supporters and has been used as an argument against efforts to better the condition of the poor. During the 20th century, environmentalists used Malthus' argument to stress that the Earth cannot sustain too many people and that resources will run out unless population growth is brought under control. Famous examples are the population bomb, written by Paul Ehrlich, and the report for the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth. The latter was written by a team of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Both works predicted disaster for humanity due to rapid population growth outstripping resource supply. Ehrlich made a grim prediction that, in the 1970s and 80s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash program embarked upon now. Both books urged that radical action was needed to limit overpopulation. Limits to Growth and The Population Bomb rekindled Malthus' theory in the 20th century, and a debate whether Malthus was right or wrong. Up till the present day, it seems that history proved Ehrlich and other doomsayers wrong, since the mass starvations predicted for the latter quarter of the 20th century never occurred. The reasons for this are multiple, but one of the important factors that Malthus could not have foreseen was the demographic transition. The demographic transition is a shift in population development from a situation of high birth rates and high mortality during the pre-industrial age to a new situation with low birth rates and low mortality during the post-industrial age. The demographic transition is attributed to a more affluent and better educated population that has access to contraceptives. More importantly, Malthus and the 20th century authors mentioned before failed to account for improvements in technology such as the use of fertilizers, pesticides and mechanization. These were made possible with cheap, readily available energy contained in fossil fuels, which unleashed the greatest increase in food production the world has ever seen, enabling Earth population to increase 7-fold since Malthus' day. The growth of food production outstripped the rates of population growth. However, there are signs that Malthus' conclusions were not entirely wrong, and that the increase in food production is slowing. In the first decade of the 21st century, food prices increased quite rapidly. Between 2005 and the summer of 2008, the prices of wheat and corn tripled, and the price of rice increased 5-fold. This led to food riots in nearly 24 countries, mainly in the developing world. But unlike previous shocks driven by short-term local regional food shortages, this price spike came in a year when the world's farmers reaped a record grain crop. Why then high food prices? This time, the high prices were a symptom of a larger problem within the worldwide food web, one that's not going away anytime soon.
The fundamental truth that Malthus proclaimed remains the truth. There cannot be more people on this earth than can be fed. Many people would like to deny that this is so. they would like to believe in that oxymoron, sustainable growth. Kenneth Boulding, President Kennedy's environmental advisor 45 years ago, said something about this. Anyone who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a physically finite planet, he said, is either mad or an economist.
Due to advances in modern medicine and the associated extended life expectancy, the world population has been growing substantially. As of this moment, there are 7.2 billion souls on Earth, adding 200,000 to it every day. It's only a matter of time before those countries will be full as well. Scientists believe that in 2100 we will reach the population capacity. 10 billion people will walk the Earth. Not all are as fortunate to live accordingly to the Western standards. The planet can only sustain 4 billion of those rich men. If we continue to live the way we do now, natural resources like water, oil and wood will finally run out. The battle for fresh water is already a big issue in Africa. Poor people simply cannot cover the costs of water, and the gap between the rich and downtrodden is getting bigger. This and the fact that people are also forced to live closely to each other, causing friction and irritations, can lead to major social tensions. But these social changes are not the only changes that occur. A strong growth in populace affects the Earth and her inhabitants in various other ways, such as on a physical, geographical, and demographical level. There is a discussion whether the growing population is connected with climate change, and in particular, the greenhouse effect, pollution, and the heightened carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere.
The world is not sustainable at the present population. We have too many people.
We're already way, way above what the planet can sustain in the long term.
Human beings have used more natural resources since the end of World War II than in all of human history before.
The whole reason that consumption has become an issue is because there are so many of us that there is not enough to share for all.
The most recent calculations are that a sustainable population, which gave people a maximum number of options, would be about 2 billion or 1.5 billion people.
So the key is to bring population to a stable level.
If you manage somehow to halve each person's consumption on average, but you allow population size to double, you haven't gained at all. Because if you have half as much consumption per person, but twice as many persons, you're right where you started from.
Another solution would be to stop vaccinating. People will be more susceptible to diseases, and epidemics will cause a natural outflow of our species. This idea is plausible, yet revolting.
If you're going to talk about a sustainable society, you then have to let the population decline.
Gradual population decline is exactly what we want.
And the sooner we move in that direction, the more likely we are to avoid a really catastrophic problem for humanity.
Another impressive government report on biodiversity, published this year, Making Space for Nature in a Changing World, is rather similar. It discusses all the rising pressures on wildlife in the United Kingdom, but it doesn't mention our growing population as being one of them, which is particularly odd when you consider that Europe, England rather, is already the most densely populated country in Europe. Most bizarre of all was a recent report by a Royal Commission on the environmental impact of demographic change in this country, which denied that population size was a problem at all, as though 20 million extra people, more or less, would have no real impact. Of course, it's not our only or even our main environmental problem, but it's absurd to deny that, as a multiplier of all the others, it is a problem. I suspect that you could read a score of reports by bodies concerned with global problems and see that population is clearly one of the drivers that underlies them all, and yet find no reference to this obvious fact in any of them. Climate change tops the environmental agenda at present. We all know that every additional person will need to use some carbon energy, if only for firewood for cooking, and will therefore create more carbon dioxide, though of course a rich person will produce vastly more than a poor one. Similarly, we can all see that every extra person is or will an extra victim of climate change, though the poor will undoubtedly suffer more than the rich. Here and there, at last, there are signs of a recognition of the problem. The Save the Children Fund mentioned it in their last report. The Royal Society has assembled a working party of scientists across a wide range of disciplines who are examining the problem. But what can each of us do, you or I? Well, there's just one thing I would ask. Break the taboo in private and in public as best you can and as you judge right. Until it's broken here, until it's broken, there is no hope of the action we need. Wherever and whenever we speak of the environment, add a few words to ensure that the population element is not ignored. If you're a member of a relevant NGO, invite them to acknowledge it. If you belong to a church, and especially if you're a Catholic, because its doctrine on contraception is a major factor in this problem, suggest they consider the ethical issues involved. I see the Anglican bishops in Australia have actually dared to do so. If you have contacts in government, ask why the growth of our population, which affects every department, is yet no one's responsibility. Big, empty Australia has appointed a sustainable population minister. So why can't small, crowded Britain? The Hawaiian goose, the oryx, the imperial eagle, which sounded the environmental alarm 50 years ago, were, you might say, the equivalent of canaries in coal mines, warnings of impending and even wider catastrophe. Make a list of all the other environmental problems that now afflict us and our poor, battered planet. The increase of greenhouse gases and consequential global warming, the acidification of the oceans and the collapse of fish stocks, the loss of the rainforest, the spread of deserts, the shortage of arable land, the increase in violent weather, the growth of megacities, famine, migration patterns, the list goes on and on. But they all share one underlying cause. Every one of these global problems, social as well as environmental, becomes more difficult and ultimately impossible to solve with ever more people. Thank you.
Changes in demographics will not go unnoticed. We are getting older, and at the same time, the continuing population growth could result in one-child policies, or even having offspring at a later age.
We're still forecasting more people, no relief in sight for the foreseeable future. Beside the traffic jams and smog, food and water shortages are predicted. We can look forward to fisheries collapse as well. It's not looking good for greenhouse gas emissions either, as global...
Population pyramids tell us far more about a country than just a set of numbers, by showing both where it's been and where it's headed within a single image. Russia, with the largest territory in the world, has roughly the same total population as Nigeria, a country 1/16 its size. But this similarity won't last long. One of the populations is rapidly growing, while the other is slowly declining. Here, the data is divided by gender, with females on one side and males on the other. The population numbers are shown for each 5-year age interval, starting from 0 to 4 and continuing up to 100 and up. These intervals are grouped together into pre-reproductive, 0 to 14, reproductive, 15 to 44, and post-reproductive years, 45 and up. Such a population pyramid can be a powerful predictor of future population trends. For example, Rwanda's population pyramid shows it to be a fast-growing country. With most of the population being in the youngest age groups at the bottom of the pyramid, the number will grow rapidly in the coming years. As today's children reach their reproductive years and have children of their own, the total population is almost certain to double within the next few decades. For our second example, let's look at Canada, where most of the population is clustered around the middle of the graph. Because there are less people in the pre-reproductive age groups than there are in the reproductive ones, the population will grow more slowly as the number of people reaching their reproductive years decreases. Finally, let's look at Japan. Because the majority of its population is in its post-reproductive years, and the number of people is smaller at each younger interval, this means that at current rates of reproduction, the population will begin to decline as fewer and fewer people reach reproductive age.
Japan has enjoyed economic prosperity for the past 42 years, but recently, China's economy is cut up. And as of 2010, Japan's GDP ranking has fallen to number 3. Japan has one of the longest life expectancies in the world. According to the World Health Organization, Japanese men have a life expectancy of 82 years, which is tied at 5th, and women have the longest in the world at 87 years old. In fact, in March 2014, a Japanese woman just had her 116th birthday and became the oldest living person in the world. Yay! Japan is roughly the size of California, but when we compare it to the US, Japan has a population that is roughly 1/3 of America. So that's 127 million people, all living on an island that is just 4% of the size of the United States. The population density of Japan is focused around major metropolitan areas, the biggest two being Tokyo and Osaka. If we compare the density of Japan and the US, you will see something shocking. The US has roughly 1 person per 2 football fields. Japan's average density is 11 people. Tokyo, one of the largest cities in the world, holds an astonishing 192 people in the same space. As time goes on, the rural areas of Japan are projected to slowly lose more and more people, and by 2060, much of the countryside will only have ghost towns. According to a government report, Japan's current population of 127 million will go down to 106 million by 2040, and it will decline to 86 million by 2060. That's 30% decrease from 2010. In addition, by the time Japan reaches 2060, the largest demographic will become 86-year-olds. That's 4 out of 10 people who will be over the age of 65.
Comparing these 3 population pyramids side by side shows us 3 different stages in the demographic transition as a country moves from a pre-industrial society to one with an industrial or post-industrial economy. Countries that have only recently begun the process of industrialization typically see an increase in life expectancy and a fall in child mortality rates as a result of improvements in medicine, sanitation, and food supply, while birth rates remain constant, leading to a population boom. Developing countries that are farther along in the industrialization process begin to see a fall in birth rates due to factors such as increased education and opportunities for women outside of childrearing, and a move from rural to urban living that makes having large families less economically advantageous. Finally, countries in advanced stages of industrialization reach a point where both birth and death rates are low, and the population remains stable or even begins to decline. Now let's take a look at the projected population pyramids for the same 3 countries in 2050. What do these tell us about the expected changes in each country's population? And what kinds of factors can alter the shape of these future pyramids? A population pyramid can be useful not only as a predictor of a country's future, but as a record of its past. Russia's population pyramid still bears the scars of World War II, which explains both the fewer numbers of elderly men compared to elderly women and the relatively sudden population increase as soldiers returned from the war and normal life resumed.
The population of Russia is dwindling. The United Nations estimates say that the country's population will be 116 million people by the year 2050, which will be 30 million less people than in 2000 when President Vladimir Putin took power. In 1986, after former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev closed 90% of Moscow's alcohol stores, the birth rate reached new 20-year highs, but by the early 90s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the population started to decline again. The life expectancy of Russians has fallen to under 70 years in 2012. Another report shows that other widely believed negative facts about Russia may have been true at some point, but many are changing for the better. For instance, the country's military spending today as a percentage of GDP is not as high as widely believed, particularly when compared to the numbers in early 90s. The death rate in Russia from accidental alcohol poisoning has been declining over the past 10 years, and it is lower than it was during Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign.
China's population pyramid reflects the establishment of the one-child policy 35 years before, which prevented a population boom such as that of Rwanda, but also led to sex-selective abortions, resulting in more male children than female children.
In 1979, China introduced the one-child policy. The purpose of this was to halve the population in one generation, but this brings forth another issue. The labor force, the actual number of people available for work, will be too small to support the economy in 2025.
Less children equals a better life. This is a slogan Iranians born in the late 70s and 80s grew up with, but with a population growth rate of around 1.3%, this may have to change. Iran has had 2 population growth control experiences in the last 50 years. The first family planning measures were introduced by the government in the 1960s, when there was a drastic population growth. After the Islamic Revolution in 1979, the plan was abandoned until 1986. In the 1980s and 1990s, the government implemented strict family planning laws after a baby boom following the revolution, and while the country was struggling with many economic problems during and after the 8-year Iran-Iraq War. In Iran, to have or not to have children is no longer the question. With the spotlight on population growth, how many children should a couple have and what the government can do to encourage large families is more of the hot topic researchers, experts, lawmakers, and government officials are discussing. Most Iranian families are not planning on having more than 2 children, and many are happy with having only 1. The declining population growth rate has alarmed both the officials and observers, prompting them to come up with a long list of proposed measures to reverse the trend, which could lead to future social, economic, and security-related problems unless it is dealt with in time.
If Singapore's fertility rates remain low, its resident population will decline and will be extremely aged without immigration. This was a key finding of a study by the Institute of Policy Studies.
Not enough babies, a graying population, and the need to bring in immigrants. These are issues that population planners grapple with.
The aging and shrinking of Germany's population will be the country's primary demographic challenge in the coming decades. Germany has one of the lowest fertility rates in Europe, with 1.4 children per woman, well below the average of 2.1 children per woman that are considered necessary to maintain stable population levels. At the same time, life expectancy is 80 years, one of the highest in the continent. This combination of low fertility and high life expectancy will have 2 effects in Germany. First, the country's population is projected to fall from the current 82 million to around 65 million by mid-century. Second, Germany's population will age significantly, a process that will challenge the structure of its labor force. In 2010, Germany had about 50 million people between 20 and 65 years old. Official statistics expect the population of this age group to fall to below 36 million by 2060, when more than half of Germany's population will be older than 51. This process of population decline and aging will pose substantial challenges for Germany. First, the country will have to find a way to maintain high rates of labor productivity in the context of an aging workforce. The German government will also need to approve difficult changes to social security and pension systems. These types of reforms are already proving controversial in most other European countries. Attracting immigrants could mitigate the effects of population aging, but the arrival of foreign workers is unlikely to reverse Germany's population decline. Even if Germany managed to attract an average of 200,000 workers a year, its population would still decline during the next half-century. The arrival of a massive wave of immigrants also carries the risk of generating social unrest in the domestic population. Demographic change in Germany will have economic effects as well. Germany is projected to lose its trade surplus by 2030 due to decreased exports resulting from lower productivity and growing imports by retirees. However, the German GDP per capita would increase as a consequence of population decline. Finally, a decline in population could lead to a decline in Germany's economic and political power. Other countries with more favorable demographic trends, such as France, the United Kingdom, and Turkey, will likely see their position strengthen and eventually challenge Germany's role as Europe's powerhouse.
The pyramid for the United States shows the baby boom that followed World War II.
Population growth in the U.S. slowed a bit during the past decade, but don't be fooled. The U.S. is still growing rapidly compared to most countries in the developed world.
Imagine, if you will, the United States population growing every day by an amount large enough to found a small town, about 7,800 people, and then extend that to a full year when the population grows enough to just about fill the city limits of the city of Chicago, 2.8 million people, because that's how fast the United States population grows every year. In fact, you might remember 2006 when the U.S. population topped 300 million. Well, people aren't talking about it much yet, but the end of 2010 marked the point where we'd already grown to 310 million people. And by 2025, we'll hit 350 million people. Now, in contrast to the rapidly growing population in the United States, I want you to stop and imagine for a moment a nation where the population is actually declining. Tax revenues would be suffering. Business revenues would be suffering because there'd be a smaller market to sell to. There'd be very few new houses being built. In fact, there might be very little new construction at all, except for government-sponsored projects that were paid for just to try to keep things going. A shrinking workforce would not be able to meet the demands of an ever-aging population. And the economy would be declining and declining relative to the nations in the rest of the world. And that's exactly the challenge faced in the near future by countries like Japan, Russia, and many of the nations in Europe, where populations will actually be declining. It's because America has a high fertility rate or high birth rate relative to many other well-developed nations. It's a tremendous advantage that gives us a great pull ahead of countries in Europe, Russia, Japan, many nations in Southeast Asia. It's a great advantage.
Bill Gates.
We need to meet a new constraint, and that constraint has to do with CO2. CO2 is warming the planet, and the equation on CO2 is actually a very straightforward one. If you sum up the CO2 that gets emitted, that leads to a temperature increase, and that temperature increase leads to some very negative effects. Now, the exact amount of how you map from a certain increase in of CO2 to what temperature will be and where the positive feedbacks are, there's some uncertainty there, but not very much. And there's certainly uncertainty about how bad those effects will be, but they will be extremely bad. I asked the top scientists on this several times, do we really have to get down to near zero? Can't we just cut it in half or a quarter? And the answer is that until we get near to zero, the temperature will continue to rise. And so that's a big challenge. It's very different than saying, we're a 12-foot high truck trying to get under a 10-foot bridge and we can just sort of squeeze under. This is something that has to get to zero. Now, we put out a lot of carbon dioxide every year, over 26 billion tons. For each American, it's about 20 tons. For people in poor countries, it's less than 1 ton. It's an average about 5 tons for everyone on the planet. And somehow we have to make changes that will bring that down to zero. It's been constantly going up. It's only various economic changes that have even flattened it at all. So we have to go from rapidly rising to falling and falling all the way to zero. This equation has 4 factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero. And that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra. But let's take a look. First, we've got population. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. But there we see an increase of about 1.3. The second factor is the services we use. This encompasses... Now, malaria is, of course, transmitted by mosquitoes. I brought some here so you could experience this. We'll let those roam around the auditorium a little bit.
David Rockefeller.
The negative impact of population growth on all of our planetary ecosystems is becoming appallingly evident.
Ted Turner.
We've got to stabilize the population. When I was born, there were
so what's wrong with the population? I mean,
with too many people. That's why we have global warming. We have global warming because too many people are using too much stuff.
But
if there were less people, they'd be using
George
less
Soros.
stuff.
Now we have a global capitalist system. The power of the states is greatly reduced, which incidentally I applaud.
About 50% of all of that population growth is occurring in only a handful of nations, 9 nations to be exact, including the United States, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and a few nations in Africa, accounting for 1/2 of all global population growth.
As populations stagnate or even decline in Europe, Japan, and China, Africa's population of 1 billion is expected to more than double by 2050. More people means more consumption, more production, more growth. African economies grew on average around 6% last year. That's 3 times the pace of America's growth and faster than many Asian countries. Perhaps the most crucial thing to watch is how Africa deals with its greatest resource, not oil, not minerals, but people. Africa's share of the world's population will rise from 1/7 to about 1/5 by the middle of this century. If Africans get the right access to education, healthcare, good governance, and jobs, Africa will be a powerhouse. If not, the population growth is a curse, not a blessing. But what African countries need is not so much external attention, but internal reform.
The sensible place to begin is with investments in basic health services in those parts of the world that are most susceptible to outbreaks of infectious disease. Whether we're talking about preventing the next epidemic or building upon the enormous global health gains of the past 2 decades, the time to act is now. The need for foreign assistance remains strong, and recent events demonstrate its urgency.
Thanks for having me follow the greatest and most important philanthropist in the history of the world. I'm sure I'm going to come off great.
You're welcome.
This isn't charity or aid in the traditional sense. It's good business. With proper training and strategic investments, agriculture will become a driving force for Congo's economy, supporting the more than 60% of Congolese, that's 40 million people, whose families rely on agriculture as a primary source of income. Simply put, we believe that a country with enough arable land to feed 1/3 of the world's population should not struggle to feed its own people, to send its own kids to school, or for basic health care.
So for the next boom in the near future, keep in mind the world's population ballooning to 8 billion people by 2025, while America's population expands to 350 million from today's 310 million. Think about the advantages that can give the United States, a growing consumer base, an expanding workforce, particularly when compared to aging, shrinking populations in many of the world's other developed nations, including many in Europe, Russia, Japan. Think about the expanding tax base and the advantage that can give America when trying to pay down today's terrifyingly high levels of government debt and obligations.
Today's increasingly interconnected world, facing issues such as food shortages, ecological threats, and economic disparities, it is increasingly important for both scientists and policymakers to have a rich and complex understanding of populations and the factors affecting them.
I think we can all agree there are too many people in the world, and we really should limit our reproduction. But too many people is not the reason that half the population of the world has to live in hunger and squalor, and the rest of us lives of desperation and alienation.